Okay. Senator from Utah.
Mr. President, I rise today to address the current situation in Syria. First, I welcome the Vice President's announcement of a ceasefire which will prevent further loss of life. I hope the agreement is honored. But at the heart of this matter is a central question of why these terms and assurances were not negotiated before the President consented to withdraw our troops. Let me briefly recount what's happened in the past 7 days since the U.S. announced our withdrawal. The Kurds, suffering loss of life and property, have allied with Assad. Russia has assumed control of our previous military positions, and the U.S. has been forced in many cases to bomb some of our own facilities to prevent their appropriation by Russia and Turkey. The announcement today is being portrayed as a victory. It is far from a victory. Serious questions remain about how the decision was reached to precipitously withdraw from Syria and why that decision was reached. Given the initial details of the ceasefire agreement, the administration must also explain what America's future role will be in the region, what happens now to the Kurds, and why Turkey will face no apparent consequences. Further, the ceasefire does not change the fact that America has abandoned an ally. Adding insult to dishonor, the administration speaks cavalierly, even flippantly, even as our ally has suffered death and casualty. Their homes have been burned and their families have been torn apart. We know the truth about our Kurd allies. They lost 11,000 combatants in our joint effort to defeat ISIS. We dropped bombs from the air and provided intelligence and logistics behind the lines. The Kurds lost thousands of lives. 86 brave Americans also lost their lives so tragically. It's argued that the Kurds were fighting for themselves. Of course they were. That's the nature of an alliance. We fight together, each pursuing our own vital interests. America leaves no soldiers behind. Often at great cost in blood and treasure, we recover our dead and our wounded, and we free our men and women who are held captive. This is a matter of American honor and promise. So too is the principle that we stand by our allies, that we do not abandon our friends. The decision to abandon the Kurds violates one of our most sacred duties. It strikes at American honor. What we have done to the Kurds will stand as a blood stain in the annals of American history. There are broad strategic implications of our decision as well. Iranian and Russian interests in the Middle East have been advanced by our decision. At a time when we're applying maximum pressure on Iran by giving them a stronger hand in Syria, we've actually weakened that pressure. Russia's objective to play a greater role in the Middle East has also been greatly enhanced. The Kurds, out of desperation, have now aligned with Assad. So America is diminished. Russia, Iran, and Assad are strengthened. And so I ask how and why this decision was reached. I serve on the Foreign Relations Committee, and given the Syria decision taken by the administration, I might be forgiven for wondering why our committee even exists. I say this because apparently the decision to leave Syria was made without consultation with the committee or even with the committee chairman and ranking member. Just 3 weeks ago, our subcommittee held hearings to receive an extensive analysis of the conditions and the way forward in Syria. It was presented to us by the Syria Study Group, a bipartisan, congressionally mandated commission tasked with providing an in-depth assessment of the conditions in Syria and to provide recommendations for American strategy going forward. So far as I'm aware, the administration made no effort to contact those who attended that hearing or to speak with the Syria Study Group to be able to understand the content in their extensive published report. I ask whether it is the position of the administration that the United States Senate, a body of 100 people representing both political parties, is to be entirely absent from decisions of the magnitude just taken in Syria. Now, some argue that we should not have been in Syria in the first place because there was not a vote taken by the Senate to engage in war there. I disagree. Congress has given the president legal authority and funding to fight against terrorists in Syria. However, even if one, for purposes of argument, believed that no authorization had been given, that's really irrelevant to the decision as to the withdrawal once we have allied with a people, the Kurds, committed to defend them, and together defeated ISIS. Once you jump in the ocean to save a drowning soul, you don't turn around with the excuse that you didn't have to jump in the first place. It is a matter of commitment. Others argue that we should just get out of a messy situation like this. The Middle East, they say, has had wars going on forever. Just let them have at it. There's, of course, a certain logic to that position as well. But again, it applies only to the original decision as to whether or not we should have gone into Syria. Once we have engaged and made the commitments we made, honor as well as self-interest demand that we not abandon our allies. It's been suggested that Turkey may have called America's bluff, telling the president they were coming no matter what we did. If that's so, we should know it, for it would tell us a great deal about how we should deal with Turkey now and in the future. Some have argued that Syria is simply a mess, with warring groups and subgroups, friends and allies shifting from one side to the other, and thus we had to exit because there was no reasonable path for us to go forward. Are we incapable of understanding and shaping complex situations? Russia seems to have figured it out. Are we less adept than they? And are our principles to be jettisoned when we find things get messy? The administration claims that none of these reasons are accurate. Instead, the president has said that we left to fulfill a commitment to stop endless wars, to bring troops home, to get them out of harm's way, perhaps to save money. I find these reasons hard to square. Why? Well, we withdrew 1,500 troops in Syria, but we're adding 2,000 troops in Saudi Arabia. And all totaled, we have some 60,000 troops in the Middle East. Assuming for the sake of understanding that getting out of endless wars was the logic for the decision, why would we take action so precipitously? Why would we not warn our ally, the Kurds, of what we're about to do? Why would we not give them time to also withdraw, or perhaps to dig in to defend themselves? Clearly, the Turks had a heads up because they were able to start bombing within mere hours. I simply don't understand why the administration did not explain in advance to Erdogan that it's unacceptable for Turkey to attack an American ally. Could we not insist that together we develop a transition plan that protects the Kurds, secures the ISIS prisoners, and meets the legitimate concerns of Turkey as well? Was there no chance for diplomacy? Are we so weak and so inept diplomatically that Turkey forced the hand of the United States of America? Turkey? I believe that it's imperative that public hearings are held to answer these questions, and I hope the Senate is able to conduct those hearings next week. I note in closing that I also hope the ceasefire agreement is honored and that Turkey ends its brutal killing. But I note that lives are already lost and American honor has already been tarnished. We once abandoned a red line. Now we abandon an ally. Mr. President, we need answers. What has happened in Syria should not happen again, and we, the Senate, must take action to make sure that it does not. I yield the floor.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. President. I, too, rise this afternoon to discuss the situation in Syria. Let me commend my colleague, Senator Romney, for his very thoughtful and very timely and very important comments. We all recognize that the situation in Syria is highly fluid, but it is important, I think, to state the case with respect to the President's decision to acquiesce to President Erdogan's offensive against the Kurds. The President's decision is a disaster for our partners in the fight against ISIS and the United States foreign policy more broadly spoken. While I welcome the temporary ceasefire announced a short time ago and hope that a permanent ceasefire can be achieved, it does not absolve President Trump of responsibility for his betrayal of our Kurdish partners and his role in unleashing violence and instability in northern Syria. It is not clear whether Turkey made any concessions as part of the deal struck with the U.S. delegation or whether Kurdish forces will comply. If not, I am concerned that additional violence is likely to follow and we will have little leverage to prevent it. In fact, there is a quote attributed to the Turkish Foreign Minister Mevlut Cavusoglu by the White House reporter for CNN, and she quotes the Turkish Foreign Minister as saying, "This is not a ceasefire. We will pause the operation for 120 hours in order for the terrorists to leave. We will only stop the operation if our conditions are met." So indeed, even this supposed ceasefire may not materialize as a ceasefire. But the reality is that the blood of Kurds, many Kurds, is on President Trump's hands, and thousands of hardened ISIS prisoners could be let loose as a result of his hasty and uninformed decision. President Trump's decision to abandon our close partners also strengthened the hand of Erdogan, Putin, Assad, and Khamenei. Those are not friends. Those are, in many cases, adversaries and antagonists. Members of the administration claim that the U.S. government opposed the Turkish incursion, but the president's own actions and statements make clear that he gave Erdogan a green light. The president ordered our military to begin a phased withdrawal from Syria last December, a decision that prompted the resignation of former Secretary of Defense Mattis and surely gave the Turks the impression that he would fold when pressed by Erdogan. Not surprisingly, he did. On that phone call, Erdogan was pushing against an open door. He knew it. The president knew it. And that's why the Turks came across the line. Stating that we should let the Kurds and Turks fight it out because of their long-standing grievances, as the president has said repeatedly, betrays both our national security interests in the Middle East and our own American ideals. It is shameful that the White House statement released after the president's call with Erdogan did not even criticize the planned Turkish incursion or warn of potential consequences if it went forward. It wasn't until the following day, after a bipartisan and international outcry, that the president began to express any concern about Turkish plans, while at the same time reiterating his invitation for Erdogan to visit the White House next month. It is impossible to read the president's initial statements as anything but acquiescence. Furthermore, the president's statements over the following days sought to distance the United States from the Kurds and the foreseeable consequences of his decision with regard to ISIS and the humanitarian challenges in northern Syria. The violence we have witnessed over the last few days in northern Syria was the direct result of an impulsive president making decisions counter to the advice of our national security experts. President Trump has often expressed disdain for the career of military, diplomatic, and intelligence professionals our nation relies on to develop and implement sound national security policy. We are once again seeing the ramifications of his incompetence. The president's stunning ignorance of the complexities of the Middle East was on full display over the weekend in a tweet where he seemed not to have an understanding of the location or identity of the separate Kurdish groups with whom we have partnered in Syria and Iraq. The Secretaries of Defense and State both insist they were consulted by the president on this decision. Maybe so, but it is clear that he didn't heed their advice or that of our national security experts. I'm not aware of any security experts who advocated for standing by while the Turkish military carries out an offensive against our Kurdish partners. In fact, on October 2nd, just 4 days before the phone call between Presidents Trump and Erdogan, the State Department's Special Envoy for Syria, Joel Rayburn, publicly warned, "We certainly think that a conflict along the Turkey-Syria border would serve the interest of all the bad actors in the conflict and in the surrounding region, whether that's ISIS or al-Qaeda or the Iranian regime or what have you. Though that was his special envoy. The president's capitulation to Erdogan runs directly counter to all of the administration's stated objectives in Syria. The administration's stated strategy is to, 1, defeat ISIS, 2, force the removal of Iranian-aligned foreign forces from Syria, and 3, achieve a negotiated political settlement to the Syrian civil war in line with the United Nations resolutions. The security and humanitarian catastrophe that President Erdogan has unleashed with Trump's approval will make achieving any of these goals nearly impossible. The violence in northern Syria over the last few days has led to the displacement of at least 160,000 people, the suspension of humanitarian assistance into affected areas, the escape of an unidentified number of ISIS detainees, and the horrific killing of unarmed civilians, including incidents that Secretary of Defense Esper has described as potential war crimes. Just weeks ago, at our urging, the SDF removed personnel from border areas, relocated heavy weapons, and destroyed defensive fortifications in northern Syria. They did so even in the face of continued Turkish military buildup along the Syrian border because they believed the United States and Turkey had agreed to a security mechanism in good faith that could avoid bloodshed. It seems that they were wrong to put their faith in this administration. The Turkish incursion into Syria has undermined years of effort against ISIS by the United States and the international community. Despite the elimination of the so-called physical caliphate, ISIS is not defeated. Former Secretary of Defense Mattis correctly warned over the weekend that ISIS will resurge if pressure against the group isn't sustained. Perhaps even more damaging than the current situation in Syria is the long-term impact of the President's decision on our standing in the world and our ability to achieve the goals outlined in the National Defense Strategy of his administration. The President's short-sighted abandonment of the Kurds is a strategic disaster that raises grave doubts among our allies and friends about whether the United States, under this President, can be counted on to defend our shared interests. Given the diverse national security challenges we face, we must attract and rely upon partners that share our interests. Our military leaders often promote the virtues of the by, with, and through approach, especially when it comes to counterterrorism. Since 9/11, we have built partnerships with local forces throughout the world, from North and East Africa to the Middle East and across the Pacific, to enable efforts against violent extremist groups. We have sought to apply exquisite capabilities only possessed by the U.S. military to support local partners doing the preponderance of the fighting and dying in service to our shared objective of containing and defeating such violent groups. Contrary to President Trump's assertions, we are not engaged in an endless war in Syria. In fact, the U.S. partnership with the SDF should be viewed as a model of how to leverage an economy of force commitment of U.S. military capabilities to achieve strategic effects, thereby obviating the need for large numbers of U.S. personnel to be put at risk. In Syria, relatively small numbers of U.S. forces on the ground enabled a Kurdish and Arab ground force of approximately 60,000 personnel. With our help, the SDF liberated millions of innocent civilians from the violent oppression of ISIS and defeated the so-called physical caliphate. Some have estimated that the SDF, the Syrian Defense Force, made up of Kurds and some Arab Syrians, lost more than 10,000 fighters taking on ISIS. It's true that many who joined the SDF did so to liberate their homes from ISIS. However, it is also true that even after their homes were liberated, the SDF, Kurds and Arabs alike, continued to pursue ISIS all the way through the Euphrates River Valley, where the last remnants of the physical caliphate were ultimately defeated earlier this year. The SDF was not only fighting for themselves, they were also fighting for us. They were fighting to help ensure that there were no more ISIS-directed or inspired attacks like those carried out in Paris, Brussels, Istanbul, Orlando, and San Bernardino. After the SDF successfully liberated the territory formerly controlled by ISIS, they also maintained custody of more than 10,000 ISIS detainees, including more than 2,000 foreign fighters, even when many of their home countries refused to take them back. Given the sacrifices of the SDF in the fight against ISIS, it was particularly insulting for President Trump to imply that the SDF may not now be releasing ISIS detainees to get us involved, in his words, in the ongoing violence in northern Syria. As our military leaders will tell you, our partnership with the SDF was not only built on our shared opposition to ISIS, but also trust established between our forces fighting shoulder to shoulder against the common enemy. They deserve more from the United States and President Trump in the face of the demands by Turkey's autocratic leader. Given all the SDF has sacrificed in furtherance of the fight against ISIS and our partnership, our betrayal of their trust is nothing short of appalling. Again, just days before President Trump's fateful call with Erdogan, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East publicly stated that we, quite frankly, could not carry out our national defense strategy if it weren't for partners like the SDF. I fear that the President's impulsive abandonment of the Kurds has done significant and lasting damage to the standing of the United States in the world, shaking the confidence of our allies and losing valuable partners in a region where the United States has critical national security interests. Congress and the international community must send a clear bipartisan signal to the President that we do not condone the Turkish incursion into northern Syria or the President's decision to abandon the Kurds. President Trump must rescind the invitation for President Erdogan to visit the United States in November. We should not welcome an autocrat who is responsible for endangering our troops on the ground in Syria, the release of dangerous ISIS fighters, the mass displacement of hundreds of thousands of civilians, and violence against non-combatants, which, if reports are true, may amount to war crimes. The United States does not need to stand alone in condemning the violence in northeastern Syria. Our partners in the counter-ISIS coalition share our concerns about the damage the Turkish incursion has caused to our efforts to defeat ISIS and the potential humanitarian cost. The United States should take the lead within the United Nations and NATO to organize efforts to denounce Turkey's actions and restrain the tragic consequences. We must also redouble diplomatic efforts to seek a negotiated settlement to the Syrian civil war that is consistent with UN Security Council Resolution 2254 and protects the equities of the SDF and civilians living under their protection. Unfortunately, the greatest impediment to securing our national security interests in northern Syria and bringing about an end to the conflict there appears to be President Trump's inability to grasp the strategic significance of his actions. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Iowa.
Mr. President, I rise today to call attention to the dire situation which continues to unfold in northern Syria. Turkey embarked on a reckless and brutal intervention on October 9th, 2019, ostensibly to clear northern Syria of terrorist elements. They have ironically dubbed this operation Peace Spring. The departure of U.S. forces just days prior to this incursion left nothing between Turkish military forces and the predominantly Kurdish militia known as the Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF. Up until the ceasefire agreement announced today, the SDF bore the brunt of the Turkish assault. The Kurds are deeply stung by what they see as America abandoning them. This after a long, hard, and successful fight against ISIS. At the height of its power, ISIS controlled territory larger than the United Kingdom. As many Americans know, ISIS directed and inspired terrorist attacks on our homeland communities across the United States, and staged numerous attacks against our troops overseas. ISIS branches across the globe have conducted unimaginable atrocities, including targeting Christians, Yazidis, Kurds, and others who opposed their corrupt interpretation of Islam. Just one example of these atrocities is the heartbreaking stories of so-called Yazidi brides who were forced into marriages with ISIS fighters, raped and brutalized repeatedly, forced to decide whether to abandon their children or make an escape. Or the multiple stories of ISIS terror inflicted on those with disabilities, such as babies being suffocated simply for being born with Down syndrome. Together with a coalition of over 30 countries, the United States engaged in a campaign to rid the world of ISIS and to restore peace and stability to that region. But it was not a nation-state that bore the brunt of the fighting against ISIS. The Kurds and the Arabs who made up the Syrian Democratic Forces took the fight to the heart of the caliphate. With the help of United States Special Operations Forces and airstrikes, the SDF liberated lands held by the terror group, imprisoned thousands of terrorist fighters, and restored hope to hundreds of thousands who suffered under ISIS rule. In our fast-moving and quickly changing world, it is easy for some to forget the terrible threat ISIS once posed while they were at their most powerful. But it would be wrong to think we can now allow ourselves to take our foot off of our enemy's throat. Even now, ISIS cells are seeking to take advantage of the chaos in northern Syria to reconstitute and once again pose a direct threat to Americans right here in our homeland. You cannot watch what's unfolding in Syria without being fundamentally concerned about the security of our friends and our neighbors. A recapitalization of ISIS is a threat to us all. It is for this reason that I've introduced a resolution which calls on the Department of Defense and the Department of State to provide a plan within 30 days which will outline a strategy to ensure ISIS will never again threaten Americans or our allies now or in the future. This strategy will address the ongoing threat that ISIS poses regionally and globally, and will outline the plan to prevent an ISIS resurgence, contain ISIS expansion, mitigate the threat ISIS poses to the United States and our allies, and describe how our gains against ISIS since 2014 will be further protected. We cannot afford to take our eyes off of this vital task of ensuring the lasting and irreversible defeat of ISIS. We must consolidate our gains to rid the world of this terrible organization and insist on a sound strategy to ensure our success to that end. Too many of our partner forces, and indeed American brothers and sisters, those that have shared in our arms, must have fought and died in this fight, and we must ensure that those sacrifices were not made in vain. Thank you, Mr. President, and I will yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.